We always appreciate it. We had you on a couple of weeks ago, and it was a slow off season. It's still pretty slow from the Padres' perspective. We heard a bit from Mike Schilt today in the local paper, but it got us thinking, just Manny Machado coming off injury, Fernando Tatis Jr. coming off a year in which he just kind of recovered from being out for 17 or 18 months. Who's more likely analytically here? Who are you higher on bounce back wise? Machado, who in 2022 was second in MVP voting, Tatis, who in 2021 was really good. Who's expected to bounce back better in 2024?
I think Tatis, simply because health is less of an issue with him than Machado, and he's younger. There's a difference between, being 25 and 32 when it comes to, the future. Machado's future is unfortunately going to be a slope downwards, and Tatis can maintain where he is, his peak, even get back to where he was a couple years ago, and he has time to do that. So I'm more bullish on Tatis, I think.
What about Xander Bogaerts? I know the numbers on paper for last year weren't bad. They're actually pretty good for his position, but watching him every day, Dan, I mean, for 3.5 months of that season last year, it wasn't good at all. He led the league in ground ball into double plays. He had a good first month, really good last month. But for him this year, do you expect a bigger output from him coming up?
Well, the hope is that he won't be playing through any injuries. He'll be healthy. I am optimistic on Bogaerts, and what it comes down to is if Bogaerts is terrible, the Padres already had enough problems to deal with. So they don't have to worry about Bogaerts being terrible, because at that point the season might be lost from an offensive standpoint. Really what it comes down to is no matter how you feel about him, he is going to be in San Diego for another decade, and they need him to hit well. He should hit for batting average even in a down season. So that's a plus. But there are bigger questions, I think, on the Padres right now.
Dan, I think we probably asked you this 2 or 3 weeks ago, and obviously we're a few months removed from the Juan Soto trade. What do the projections look like both ways? Soto to New York in 2024, and then what the Padres got back. I mean, they got guys that are going to be in the big league roster, whether it's Michael King, some of these guys like Burrito Vasquez, a backup catcher, and Higashioka. How does it look for 2024 specifically?
Well, if you're only talking 2024, it's going to cost wins, of course. Soto, you can't really replace that bat easily, and they haven't. The gain from trading Soto is something that will happen, over 4 or 5 years if it happens. It's not really going to instantly make the Padres better now. And 2024, there are some problems to worry about, and there's not a lot of time or great options to deal with them at this point.
Taking a look at the bullpen here, Dan, they've added a lot of pieces from last year's bullpen was not great. They did lose Josh Hader, but getting Wandy Peralta, Usuk Go, Yuki Matsui, De Los Santos from the Guardians, they kind of revamped this bullpen. How do you project this bullpen to be in this season? What do you think of the moves that they've made with Peralta, Go, Suzuki, and De Los Santos?
I think it's a decent bullpen. But a lot of the front end relievers in the pen have some command issues. They do have a lot of live arms, which is a good thing. That's kind of how the Orioles sorted out their bullpen. They pretty much just got tons of interesting arms and hope they worked out. I think that the back of the bullpen doesn't look that great, but the front end is at least okay. Not elite, okay.
So, okay, Dan Szymborski, FanGraph's with us. What is your level of concern? Like, forget about the Dodgers for a second. And when we had you on a couple of weeks ago, you said, listen, as good as the Dodgers are, there's still a scenario, 10% chance, 15% chance that they may not even win the NL West. But obviously the Dodgers are going to have a superior win total heading into the year than the Padres. But how do the Padres look? And again, it's unfinished, and maybe the other teams are unfinished too. But Padres compared to the Giants, Diamondbacks, how do they look?
Generally speaking, the projections, the Diamondbacks are a little bit ahead of the Padres, and the Padres tend to be, depending on who's doing the projecting, around even with the Giants. The team had challenges, and to a great extent, the problems that existed in November are still there now in February. And as I said, there's a lot less opportunity to be able to fix some of these short-term issues.
The Padres have still a lot of holes on their roster. They don't have a left fielder. They don't have everyday center fielder. First base is an issue. Their bench is an issue. We talked a lot about yesterday, Dan, the idea of Tommy Pham or Jurickson Profar. Of those two players that I just mentioned, who do you think would be a better fit for this team, and who do you think would have a better season this upcoming year?
I think that Pham in a lot of ways is the better fit. He legitimately had a solid offensive season last year, and I'm more confident about his defense, even at 36, than I am necessarily with Profar's defense. Profar has been kind of below average everywhere. It's quite intriguing how consistently below average he is across the board defensively. But the outfield is, as you said, the outfield is very weak once you get past Tatis. You basically are going to have 2/3 of the outfield that are probably going to be near replacement level or a little above. And right now, the DH just looks like a rotation for resting players and players coming back from injury, and that's not usually ideal. So this team, even if they were unlucky last year, they're probably a worse team overall this year.
If you were, in AJ Preller's shoes and you had a limited, amount of cash you could use here, would you use it on a Pham type in the outfield, or would you use it on a free agent, back end starter type, a Michael Lorenzen? Like if you were spending it in one place, outfield or the back of your rotation, where would you spend it?
I think it would be in the outfield, simply because if you're saying what's the upside for the outfield and what's the upside for the pitching staff, the pitching staff does have upside. Drew Thorpe could tear through the upper minors. Randy Vasquez could demonstrate he can throw 150 innings and be a good 2-3 starter. They had that upside. I don't think the upside is the same for the outfield. So on some level, it makes more sense to go after an outfielder. The problem is this has been a really poor market for outfielders, unless you're going to bring in Cody Bellinger, which they're not, because he's going to get paid, and I don't think the Padres want to give $200 million to him, or even 150. I think you want to do the outfield, but you might have to be creative and pull off a trade, because free agency, there's just not that much left out there.
Besides the top teams in the National League, the Dodgers, the Braves, let's even put the Phillies up there as well, Dan. We know here in San Diego, I think the biggest concern for Padres fans is just how can they just get into the playoffs, right? And what teams do you think are they going to be able, or not be able, but going to have to compete against in the National League? We saw yesterday the trade for Corbin Burns from the Brewers. They're seemingly, I don't know if they're thinking playoffs this upcoming season, but of the teams in the National League that aren't the top tier, who are the teams the Padres should be worried about?
Well, out of the top tier, I think that people are a little too down on the Cardinals based on their season last year. One thing that happened in St. Louis is that the pitching staff completely fell apart. They had no holes. They had no spares. They let Adam Wainwright start 20 games with an ERA over 7. And while the Cardinals didn't make any exciting additions outside of Sonny Gray, they added some inning eater types when you're talking Kyle Gibson and so on. But I think that they've kind of patched up that gaping hole, and they play in the NL Central, which is going to be an easier division. And you're going to see the Cardinals probably be pretty into the wild card race. Of course, I might be wrong. The Brewers, the Corbin Burns trade, of course, helps the Padres simply because it weaks another competitor for the wild card. But I wouldn't count the Padres out for a playoff spot. I just think they're, a third tier NL team right now.
Dan, before you go, can you provide perspective for our listeners on like an Ethan Salas type? So there's huge Padres catching prospect. They don't need him. He's 17 years of age. Like, even if he were to break through in the major leagues, let's say late 24, which is kind of crazy, he'd be 18, or even to start 25, he'd still be, I think, 18 at the start of 25, turning 19 at some point in 25. Are there even like catching comps that are 18 or 19 that could pay dividends? Like, what's the value of Ethan Salas before he's 20, 21, 22 years of age at the big league level?
Catchers are kind of tricky. They tend to have very odd developmental curves. And you see a lot of guys who were pretty well regarded as prospects flame out very quickly. I think of Petrick and Charles Johnson and guys like that. Javier Valentin was a guy who was a pretty hot prospect when he was with the Twins. I think that given the difficulty of catching and the significant impact of pictures, it's the hardest position for a prospect to play. So I don't think you don't really want to expect too much from a minor league catcher. You hope they develop. You hope they develop defensively enough to stick at the position. And then you just kind of wait and see. And I think that's kind of where Salas is right now.
Dan Szymborski, FanGraphs, always great insight for our listeners here in San Diego. Dan, we appreciate it. We'll try to catch up with you again before the start of the season. So thank you.
Always fun, guys. Thanks.
All right, great stuff. Dan Szymborski. All right.